Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill Obrien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill Obrien.
Well, thank you, Agnes, and welcome to this week of broadcasting here at the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Tuesday. It is the 28th day of May in the year 2019. It is the day after Memorial Day. And let me say that we didn't do a program yesterday. It was my fault. I fully intended to do a program yesterday. We had a big family get-together scheduled, but it was supposed to happen on Sunday. And, coming in from out of state, those kinds of things. And so the whole event was supposed to happen on Sunday, and it wasn't going to have any impact on the program at all for Monday. So right up until the very end, I assumed that we would be doing a program on Memorial Day, yesterday. And then on Saturday, mid-morning, 10 o'clock in the morning, we got a call and said everything's been changed. We're doing it's going to be Monday. And so the minute I heard that, I realized that there was no way I could do a program, because this is one of those things where it took us 2 days of work to prepare for this large gathering. There were about 20 people there. And it's my wife. It was at my wife's place, so we had a lot of cleanup to do and fixing up to do and cooking to do and all that stuff. So anyway, I've got to say that as much work as it was, it may have been one of the best weekends I've had in years. I thoroughly enjoyed it. We had more fun and more laughs, and I got a story that I'm going to tell you from that event yesterday, I thought it was worth kind of pinching myself and making a mental note that I wanted to share this with here on the program today. We got settled, and we were eating, and everybody was having a good time. And so what we decided is that an old friend lives across the road. This is rural southern West Virginia. And there's an old friend of my wife's. In fact, she, considers her second mother. And she's across the road, and there was nobody. They weren't doing anything for the holiday. So decided to call her and see if she'd like to come over, because she knew all of these boys. They all grew up there. As you know, this was my wife's birthplace, so that her and her brothers and sisters, they all grew up there. So the neighbor across the road, of course, half raised these kids, and so called her to tell her that they were in for the holiday, and we were sitting outside, and it was a beautiful day, and we would love to have her if she'd like to come, and she did come. And so she came over and sat with us for 2 hours, and we had more fun and more laughs with her. But the most interesting part of it was, a lot of it was, them reminiscing about things that had happened in the past. I just sat there and enjoyed all of it. But at the best part of it was when she was on her way, when she was leaving to go home, after about 2 hours, she kind of made it a point to get everybody's attention and to say goodbye. And then she said something that I thought was worth remembering and telling this story. And she said, "I've been to several meetings recently in town and at the county level." She's very active politically, works the polls and all of that. And she said, "I've been to a lot of meetings recently, and of course, what bothers me, given the fact that I'm as old as I am, is more than half the people are on cell phones while the meeting is going on." And she said, "I've been here more than 2 hours, and I haven't seen one phone. And I just wanted to compliment everybody and thank you for giving me the experience of knowing that there are still places in this world where people get together and enjoy and interact with each other not with their phones. And I roared laughing. Everybody did. And several of the folks agreed with her. But it was a joy. That's all I can say. And I hope that everybody listening had a wonderful holiday weekend as well. I know that there's some horrendous weather in the middle of the country. Oklahoma is experiencing an unbelievable number of tornadoes, and horrible tornadoes hit Ohio yesterday, I believe, last evening. And from what I understand this morning, the devastation was severe. One death and a number of injuries, and they're still looking, searching through rubble. So from where I stand, Ohio's getting awfully close. And I think, so an awful lot of people are hurting, and I think all of us need to keep that in mind. Let me say that Agnes informed me that they're doing some revamping of the studio, so we're not going to take any calls today, because they're trying to get everything back into order. So I won't bother giving you the 800 number today, because that, you hopefully won't, you can't use it anyway. So, but I do invite you, if you do have a comment or something that you would like to say, then by all means share it with me in an email. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. Again, that's waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. If you'd like, you can communicate your thoughts to me in a comment through our Facebook page. Just go to Facebook, facebook.com, and in the search box at the top of the homepage, just type in the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution, and you'll be onto our Facebook page, and you'll see a number of postings there. Two of them I'm going to share with you in a moment. The last couple of postings that I put on the Facebook page since we were last together this past Wednesday. And at the end of each posting, you'll see a comment box along with a share box. If you click on share, it sends that posting to all your friends on your Facebook account. If you click on comment, it gives you an opportunity to fire a comment directly to me. And it works very fast, because my Facebook will notify me if a comment to one of the postings has been made. It'll immediately come up on my computer, and I'll be able to read your comment. Theoretically, it would be about the particular posting, but on the other hand, it doesn't have to be. It can be whatever it relates to the program or to the issues that we've been talking about here at the Virtual Center. The point is, we would love to hear from you, and we want to make sure that we stay in touch. The worst thing we can do is stop interacting with each other, because once the communication link is broken, then the whole question of keeping the program relevant is lost. So the only way that we can make sure that the program is meeting not only my needs but your needs is to make sure that we stay in touch and make sure you have an ongoing opportunity to share your thoughts with us on a regular basis. I guess before we start, we need to make a few comments about some of the things that have occurred since the last time we were together. And again, we have to remember, the situation as to what we're dealing with in the nation and who's in the White House at the moment. Because what we find is that 5 days is an awful long time, and an awful lot can happen, and usually does, since this administration has been in office. And of course, what we know, and the biggest issue, I guess, is that the president has made a trip to Japan, and as we speak right now, he's almost back, or he's on his way back to Washington, and probably is there by now. I heard a couple of hours ago that he was pretty close to being back in the White House. So, and while he was over there, of course, a number of things occurred. And one of the things that occurred that the media is making a big issue over, and I think it is a big issue, is the president's apparent split with John Bolton and others of his advisors on North Korea. And what I mean by this is that, as we know, Kim Jong-un fired off a number of short-range missiles last week. And a number of nations, Japan being one, and the president has been in Japan with Abe on a cordial visit, and a visit in which the president of Japan, Prime Minister of Japan, made it a priority to wine and dine the Trumps. This was a feel-good trip for him from beginning to end. But he used it in ways that are at best questionable. As a result of the missile test, short-range missile tests conducted last week in North Korea, many of the president's advisors, including John Bolton, basically made the point that this was a violation of the agreement on testing that they thought North Korea had with President Trump. They felt it was a violation, and they felt it was a serious matter. And the president, in his public comments in Japan, made the point that he disagreed with his advisors and other nations. And let me point out, as I mentioned, Abe and Japan is one of the nations that saw this as a violation. South Korea is another one. Many nations of Europe, the European Union, for example, saw it as a violation. The president disagreed with all of them and sided with Kim Jong-un, and basically said they think it's a violation. Personally, I don't think so. And then he made some statement about whether Kim Jong-un may be looking for attention or whatever. He said, the president said, I don't know why he did what he did, but I don't consider it a violation. And I think basically it was just the head of a nation that we're finding a way to get along with, getting rid of his frustrations or something like that. Even more significant, while the president was in Japan, I think, was his attack on Joe Biden. Because it's been a standing rule that you don't attack a previous president, or vice president in this case, out of the country, outside the continental United States. Because what might be political within the confines of the United States becomes an international incident when it's done on the world stage. President Trump not only did it, but he owned up to it when questioned on it, didn't deny it. Rather, he once again agreed with it. Kim Jong-un had made the statement about Joe Biden, apparently, that Joe Biden was dumb and ineffective. President Trump said in his public remarks that that's completely consistent with what he believes about Joe Biden. And then he went on and talked about the fact that Biden and Obama, the Obama administration, was soft and short-sighted and all of these other criticisms of a previous administration. Even Republican Stephen King criticized the president for this, which is rare. That's how significant, it seems to me, this particular issue was. Last week in our program, I believe, I'm kind of going from memory now, and it's close to a week ago. It'll be a week ago tomorrow, actually. But it seems to me we were talking here about declassifying all the intelligence documents at the request of the Attorney General as the Attorney General begins his investigation of the investigators that led to the Mueller report. I think I remember reading a couple of quotes. For example, Senator Mark Meadows made a statement and why this was necessary, and it was a way for the American people to find out what was happening and what had happened, and why, whether in fact the Mueller investigation was even legitimate. Based on this, after our program, our last program on Wednesday, I posted on our Facebook page a reaction to that. And if you go to our Facebook page, facebook.com, and then type in the Virtual Center in the search box, you'll see that this is a very recent posting. I think I put it on there Thursday, maybe Friday. And what I did was basically lay out the ground rules by saying that the president gave Attorney General William Barr permission to declassify intelligence information gathered in the Russia investigation in order for the American people to know exactly what they believe is part of a political witch hunt to stymie the Trump presidency. That's the rationale for the declassification of these documents. But there has been worldwide reaction to this because the documents being declassified could put the CIA agents and informants in jeopardy. In other words, when you declassify, oftentimes you're revealing not only methods of surveillance, of intelligence gathering, but you're identifying the people you depend on to do it. And there's been concern rippling since this happened last week. The White House defended its actions by saying, "Today's actions will ensure that all Americans learn the truth about the events that occurred and the actions that were taken during the past presidential election, and will restore confidence in our public institutions." This particular statement the president put up on Twitter. And my point was that this is not only unprecedented, it's dangerous. Not only does it threaten to cripple our intelligence agencies, it provides those eager to defend the president from investigation with opportunity to selectively release classified material for an agenda that is purely political. In other words, giving the Attorney General the freedom, the room to declassify any documents he wants seems to me to signify not what the White House said was giving the American people information. Mark Meadows, a Freedom Caucus member from North Carolina, said, quote, "This is candidly part of the president wanting to make sure the American people have the entire story of what went on and what will be construed by most people as improper activity within the FBI. It's also the very first step in rectifying and repairing the damage done by certain people in the FBI. And that's a quote from Mark Meadows. Well, the fact of the matter is it's also a lie, because it's very clear that while the Attorney General has the authority to declassify any documents he wants, he's not going to do that. He's not going to declassify the documents that make the president look bad, that led Mueller to write what he wrote in the Mueller report. Barr is going to concentrate on the documents that make the president look good and make the FBI look bad, because that's what the political agenda here is all about. When you think about that, you begin to realize how very dangerous this whole issue is. I made the comment in my posting. If you read Meadows, it sounds like he knows what the information is going to reveal before anyone even sees it. And the reason he knows it is because it's guaranteed predictable. I know what the information is going to say, because what they're going to do is go in and pick up all of this stuff about the FBI agent and his fiancée in the FBI and their secret emails about how much they distrusted Trump and hated Trump and all the rest of it. And that's what's going to be the focus, that kind of stuff. Not the fact that the FBI's job, when it thinks that the security of the United States is threatened, it is the FBI's job to investigate and to survey. Or, in Barr's words, if you want to use that word, to spy. So the president announced, if you remember, that President Obama had listening devices throughout Trump Tower, which proved to be false. So this investigation clearly has a political agenda or a political outcome in mind. And so the way I put it on this Facebook posting that I put up there on, I think Friday, I said, fact is, what the president has done here is place his own agenda and political future ahead of the nation's security. It's as political as anything that happened during Watergate, even more so. It's clear that our government has reached a standoff. President Trump announced in the Rose Garden last Wednesday that he would not do any legislative business with Congress until the investigations into his behavior and his finances ended. In effect, the president is threatening to make the people's business, in this case infrastructure, a bargaining chip. Extortion, in order to halt Congress from doing its constitutional business of oversight. This, I said, is political hardball. It's personal, it's vicious, and it's dangerous. When the nation reached this stage of dysfunction in 1974, Barry Goldwater and other leading Republicans went to the White House to inform President Nixon that the jig was up, that he had to resign because he lost the support of his own people. His party had lost faith in him. Goldwater and the others informed President Nixon. And then I asked the magic question. Will Mitch McConnell, William Barr, Lindsey Graham, all three of whom are depicted on the cover of the latest New Yorker, shining the president's shoes, will they do the same kind of thing that Goldwater and leading Republicans did in 1794? Don't hold your breath. Do not hold your breath. I think this is very bad. I know we covered some of this before. But since that, our last program, when we touched upon it, I had written this posting on Facebook, and I wanted to touch it touch base with you today on it, because I think it's that significant. There's one other posting that I put on Facebook since we were last together, and it's related to the Madison document, again, on property, the essay on property. And I know we've covered that document. We went through the entire document pretty much here on the air last week. But the fact of the matter is, the more you think about that document, and this was, if you remember, the essence of our last hour on our last program this past Wednesday on Sean Willence's book, No Property in Men. And I kind of wanted to retouch on that issue today. But the point is that in order to really understand what Willence is talking about in his book on slavery, it's important to understand Madison's essay on property. And you'll recall, and I'm reviewing here, I know, Madison pointed out in his March of 1792 essay that there really are two definitions of property. There's the traditional definition, and then there's a definition which is increasingly becoming more and more common, more and more popular, and Madison feels more and more dangerous. The definition of property that he is worried about is the one that defines property as man's ownership of the material things of the world. That's the one that's becoming popular. And it's tending to ease aside the more traditional understanding of the concept of property, which Madison refers to as the larger and juster approach. And again, there's no word as juster. We say more just approach to property. And that is man's rights, his freedoms, all those things in which man has a sense of ownership and could claim an aspect of property in freedom, property in your right to disagree, property in your reason to apply your skills and talents, property in your freedom to worship God as you choose, or not worship God if that's your preference. In other words, Madison said, man has a property in his opinions and the free communication of them, in his religious opinions, in the profession and practice dictated by them, in the safety and liberty of his person, in the free use of his faculties, and free choice of the objects on which to employ those faculties. In other words, Madison wrote, as a man is said to have a right to his property, he may equally be said to have a property in his rights. And that is all a quote from Madison's 1792 essay. As I pointed out in our last program last week, the difference between property and rights and property and materials things lies mostly in what I call the who, more so than the what. Man's natural desire to accumulate property, more property than he needs, John Locke attributed in his second treatise on civil government to the introduction of money as a way to assign value to one's property. Because once property had a measurable value, once you could put a dollar price on property, that instigated the desire to accumulate more and more and more and more. John Locke believes that the introduction of money into society, not man's natural instincts to be self-interested, but more so the idea that money made it possible for people to measure the value of their property and thereby compare it with the value of other people's property and draw conclusions from that. And that's exactly what happened. When government's responsibility to protect property, which Madison concedes in this essay, same thing that John Locke said, governments were created to protect man's natural rights to life, liberty, and property, John Locke said. But it's important to realize that when John Locke mentioned property in that context, he's speaking of property not as material wealth in land. He's talking about property in its broader sense, or as Madison says, the larger and juster sense. Madison calls the ownership of worldly goods as your property. Madison calls it the particular application to man's holdings in worldly possessions. What I've put in this posting, which is on our Facebook page, that when you do that, when you stop looking at property in its broader sense of everything that man has property in or a sense of ownership of, and instead begin to define property exclusively in material terms, which is what John Locke claims money made it possible to do, then you are in for a number of predictable outcomes. It leads to problems. And I would suggest it's those problems that prompt Madison to write the essay in 1792, because he sees the problem of the narrow way that property is being defined as a threat to the Constitution he's just been so instrumental in getting approved. Remember, this is 1792 March. Washington isn't inaugurated under the Constitution until 1789 March. So this is the Constitution. The government has only been in operation for 3 years. And already Madison sees problems. And the point is, my point, is that these problems are predictable. And let me explain. This is what I wrote in the posting. Once you begin to consider property in its narrower, what Madison calls particular application, to man's holdings in worldly possessions only, it leads those with the most to some dangerous, self-serving conclusions. One, the idea that government's principal responsibility is to serve the interest of property holders, not those of the society at large. Very important point. If you're looking at property in the broader sense of the word, everybody has property in that context. Everybody has freedoms. Everybody has opinions. Everybody has as the need and the want to communicate. Everybody has the particular way that they choose to make a living, try to make a living. And if government's job is to protect property in that context, that means it's protecting everybody's rights. But when you begin to define property in a more narrow sense, you're beginning to find, you're redefining government's responsibility to protect property, almost as if you're making government the servant of the wealthy, the servant of the property, the people with the most. So basically then, when you make this change in the way you interpret property, you reach the conclusion that government's principal responsibility is to serve just their interests, not everybody's. Secondly, you give the impression, the idea, that their self-interest trumps the national interest. In other words, if you begin to emphasize the protection of property in material terms, it tends to conflict with government's responsibility to protect the national interest. It tends to take precedence over the national interest. Third, that the rights of property owners linked directly to the property they own must always take precedence. Fourth, common sense seems to suggest that since it's the ownership of property that drives rights, the conclusion one naturally draws is that those people without property, material possessions, except for the freedom to acquire it, have no rights at all. And five, as people without property, these people become second-class citizens, if indeed they're citizens at all. The whole nature of our system of government is in trouble if you take this change in the way property is being interpreted and apply it and begin to look at its implications. It's those implications that prompt Madison to write this essay. What we see, I've said, from this more narrow sense of defining property is a pattern of self-serving thinking that has brought us to our nation's current state of affairs, where those with the most wield the influence and the power. Those without continue to struggle. And once again, I've said, we begin to see that our history is being written by the winners. In other words, our history is being written in a way to protect the interest of those with influence. And increasingly, those with influence are the people who have the most property. And they see government's principal responsibility to protect their property. And the way to protect it is not to regulate it, not to tax it. And so consequently, these folks begin to look at government as potentially the biggest threat, not only to their property, but to their position, their influence, their status, everything. And I closed the posting on Facebook with this comment. When you begin to look at Madison's larger and juster view of property as applying to everybody, because everybody has property in opinions, in religious conscience, in the religion they practice, in the way they earn a living, etc. All of those things are forms of property. When you begin to consider property in this broader sense, it seems to me then we have to rethink Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Because as you'll remember, Jefferson did not include property as one of the unalienable rights mentioned in the Declaration. Instead, Jefferson had life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Why didn't Jefferson include property as an unalienable right? And what I've said is that if he did that, without explaining the different definitions, and the Declaration of Independence was being written for a purpose that wasn't given to long, involved explanations like we're into here about the competing definitions of property, for example. If Jefferson had put property in there as an unalienable right without explaining what I call this complex epistemological explanation of property, it would suggest that man's right to property in material possessions alone is absolute. In other words, what you would be saying is that man's ability to own property, material things, is an absolute fundamental right that nobody can interfere with because, as Jefferson said, these unalienable rights come from the Creator. And so ostensibly, only the Creator would be able to interfere with these rights, which would mean that government could not regulate, government could not tax, government could not redistribute wealth. Effectively, government could not govern. That's the reason, it seems to me, that Jefferson did not include the word property in the Declaration of Independence. Because property was increasingly being defined in a way which, when taken to its logical conclusions, would contradict everything that the Declaration of Independence is about. It would contradict the very spirit of the revolution. This narrower definition of property is the one that the rich and powerful have been trying for so long to perpetuate. My point is, when you look at Madison's essay, you realize that this narrow definition of property as being material wealth and the influence that flows from it has no historical validity. It's a creation of the wealthy people who choose to perpetuate it. It's not what Jefferson had in mind as an unalienable right in the Declaration of Independence. It is my feeling that the broader definition of property would be consistent with what Jefferson believed the Declaration of Independence was all about. But to use the word without explaining it would send the wrong message. And that was not the message that Jefferson wanted to send. And let me point out something else. And I might say, I basically put that on Facebook. What I didn't put on Facebook was a more detailed analysis of Madison's essay. I wrote this in a short article and have submitted it for publication. Whether it will be published, I don't know. But the conclusion, that basically is the beginning of it. And then what I said, and this is not what I put on Facebook, more than half of Madison's essay is devoted to the specific dangers in respect to man's property in rights that this narrower definition of property threatens to cause. And the fact is, that's the major definition, the major fear of Madison and his reason for writing. Basically to suggest that the Constitution's system of government, separation of powers rendered operable by a system of checks and balances built into it, is the only way to ensure the protection of property in its traditional sense. In other words, everybody's rights. Most dangerous, says Madison in this essay, is the accumulation of power in the same hands. In the case of Alexander Hamilton's financial programs, which were being released in a series of reports to Congress from the Secretary of the Treasury's office, Hamilton was making it clear that the urban manufacturing, banking, and financial interests concentrated in the northeastern part of the nation were destined to benefit most from the program he was outlining. Madison takes issue with this and said basically this program that Hamilton is proposing leads directly into this more narrow view of property, and the more accepted it becomes, the less man's protection of his rights in property, or property and rights, is going to get. Madison says in his essay, quote, where an excess of power prevails, property of no sort is duly respected. No man is safe in his opinions, his person, his faculties, or his possessions. Government, Madison said, is instituted to protect property of every sort, as well that which lies in the various rights of individuals as that which the term particularly expresses. This being the end of government, the purpose of government, that alone is a just government which impartially secures to every man whatever is his own. Government is just, Madison believed, only when it's committed to securing man's property in its broadest, not its narrowest sense. Madison says that only this way can the nation become the model for other states to emulate, which John Winthrop had envisioned in 1630 in his City Upon a Hill sermon. Quote, if the United States mean to obtain or deserve the full praise due to wise and just governments, they will equally respect the rights of property and the property in rights. They will rival the government that most sacredly guards the former by repelling its example in violating the latter. They will make themselves a pattern to that end and all other governments. In other words, if we begin to adhere to protecting property in its broader sense, we will truly become the model for other nations to emulate, other governments to try to follow, to emulate. In that context, we will be the city upon a hill that Winthrop spoke of, that Ronald Reagan spoke of. But to be a nation which only protects the property of the wealthy to the exclusion of everybody else flies in the face of what the Declaration of Independence, what the Constitution of the United States are all about. It's not anything we want to hold up to the world for emulation. It's a view that we want to keep from the world. We don't want anybody to emulate us on that score. This is a very, very important issue, it seems to me. It's an extremely important concept. And let me, if I can find let me bring it into today, if I can. We've got about 10 minutes, a little bit less than 10 minutes left in this, our first hour. Dated in Salon, the digital website Salon, dated yesterday, May 27th, is a piece by Cody Kain, Kain, on China and the extent to which President Trump attacks China because of China stealing our jobs. The title of Cody Kain's article is, "No, China didn't steal our jobs. Corporate America gave them away." Very interesting thesis here. Because he points out that President Trump loves to blame China for all the jobs we lost and the devastation of American workers under what the Obama administration supported as globalization. Kain's thesis is that Trump is blaming the wrong party. The fact of the matter is, American corporations offered to relocate in China in order to take advantage of the low salaries there. China wanted the industry. China wanted the jobs. China would be foolish to turn down the offer of American corporations because she couldn't pay enough, or that she would feel like Americans workers would lose their jobs. Kain points out it's not China's business to protect American jobs. It's our business. It's our government's business. It's our government's business to make sure that American corporations don't do anything that harm American citizens. And that's exactly what allowing corporations to relocate overseas and close down plants here at the cost of jobs, that's what it resulted in. But China didn't steal the jobs. We gave them to China. And I think this is an important point. Because the fact of the matter is, it's corporate America that made these decisions. Corporate America is the one that decided to close American plants and open new plants in China. They were the ones who decided to lay off multitudes of American workers and indeed ruin entire American communities. That's not China's fault. We did that. Who profited from all of this? The executives and the shareholders of the corporations. They earn millions of dollars by cutting the costs of manufacturing, by eliminating or lowering the cost of their workforce. Thus, we face this trend of economic inequality in America that's growing wider and wider and wider. Wealth is being taken from the workers and from the middle class and transferred into the hands of executives, corporate executives, and shareholders at the top. In other words, our society is doing exactly what Madison warned us of in his 1792 essay. Cody Kane points out that we cannot expect the Chinese to up their wages in order to make sure that Americans don't continue to lose jobs. The reality is corporate America is going to continue to transfer more and more jobs to places with the lowest labor costs because that's their business. And that's what we've got to stop. Because until we stop it, the best interest of American workers will never be realized. Kane concludes that the reality is that corporate America has no incentive to protect American workers. Corporate America's incentive is to harm more workers by shifting more jobs overseas. So his recommendation is that the financial incentives have to be reconsidered, rethought. What he's talking about is the possibility that corporations, when they do send their jobs overseas, compensate the American workers displaced by doing that. In other words, if corporate America wants to relocate its manufacturing overseas, let it. But the fact of the matter is they have a responsibility to subsidize the workers here who are losing their jobs as a result of that decision. Here's the question. What would make corporate America do that? Well, the answer is obviously government. And that gets back to the issue of protecting property and protecting people's property in rights. If government continues to allow corporations to move overseas and more American workers to be displaced, government policy is supporting the interests of the corporations at the expense of the property in rights of the citizens of this nation. Government is putting its interests and its power behind the needs of the few at the expense of the many, which is exactly what Madison warned us against in his essay. So, in a sense, to wind this up, and I don't think it'll be necessary to go back and touch this particular article by Madison any more than we have. But the fact of the matter is, when you think about it, once again, we see how far-sighted and visionary the founders were. Madison saw in the basics of Hamilton's recommendations where this nation was going, and he didn't like it. And his reason for not liking it was that carried to extremes, it would disrupt the balance, the separation of powers, checks and balances system that this nation depends on in order to remain the nation that it is. He warned of the dangers. He laid out the details of why the dangers would be dangers. And he basically pointed out the way in which the Constitution protects our nation and its people from those dangers. But in this more narrow definition of property, Madison began to see early signs of danger. And it's clear that we have reached a point where he was exactly right in his fears. We have gone exactly where he warned us we better not go. I really believe that that's the important message that comes from Madison's essay. It literally changes the definition of government's priority from protecting the best interests of the many to protecting the worldly interests of the few. Right on the button at the top of the hour, almost like I planned it, but I really didn't. Except in the last 30 seconds, I kind of saw that we were going to finish right on time. So I think it's appropriate that we pause and take our break, our 5-minute break, because we're right at the top of the hour, and then we'll come back and we'll get into our second hour on today's program. It'll be a short break, so please stay with us. We'll be right back.
return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's your host, Dr. Bill Obrien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to our second hour on this Tuesday. I had to remember it's not Monday, it's Tuesday. Today is the 28th day of May in the year 2019. It is a Tuesday. It is the day after Memorial Day. For many people, a day after a big weekend, and for some Americans, unfortunately, a horrendous week weather-wise. And I mention that all the time because I'm very, very concerned about the weather extremes and the implications of climate that those extremes indicate, and the refusal of those we depend on to try to do something to offset this, to refuse even to acknowledge it. It really concerns me. I am not a scientist, but I am not so narrow that I reject the findings of those people who know in favor of those people who can't know. And I guess I'm very disturbed by people who become so insistent that they are right when they are people who can't know what others that they criticize know. And so it's disturbing. Welcome to our second hour here in today's program. I wanted to touch base once again because obviously we set it up here in the first hour by this emphasis on Madison's article on property. I realize that you're probably saying, what's the point of this article? He keeps going over the same article. I think the significance, and it just, every time I think about it, I realize more how significant this is. That how significant the warnings that Madison is telling us. And I begin to appreciate even more the depth and the vision of the Constitution to try to deal with these things. I think what amazes me, and I didn't realize this, I've been a student of the Constitution for most of my professional life. But I'll be honest with you, it's only since doing this program the last 4 or 5 years that I've gotten into the depth on the Constitution that this program has taken me to. And in the course of those investigations and doing this program, I have become so much more appreciative of the depth and the vision of the Constitution, of the founders. It amazes me how they could anticipate the problems, most of which have come to pass exactly as they predicted they might come to pass, and warned us. And the founders were able not only to warn us of the dangers, but also point out to us why they were dangerous and so dangerous, and why the Constitution was structured as it is in order to counteract those dangers. It's incredible. And I think my level of amazement just continues to increase, the level of respect that I have for the wisdom of I'm not saying they're perfect people, they're gods or anything like that. I don't mean that at all. But we would be in much better shape if we had people even half as wise as these folks tended to be. Once again, we're not taking calls today because of the updates going on in the studio. So I'm not going to give you the toll-free number because there'll be no way for the folks to answer it today. So, but I will give you my email address and our Facebook page address, because you can communicate directly with me in either of those two mediums. If you'd like to send me an email on your ideas or thoughts or whatever, then my email address is waobrien906 gmail.com. Or if you'd like to use our Facebook page, just go to one of the postings on our Facebook page, click on the comment link, and you'll have an opportunity to fire a comment directly to me. It can be about that posting, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. It can be related to other things related to our program. Point again is we look forward to hearing you. We really have to hear from you if you think about it. I'm going to sound a little bit like Donald Trump here because I'm going to go back on what I just said 5 minutes ago. I said that with the break, that would probably be the end of any mention of Madison's essay. But after we started the break and I was sitting here reflecting, it dawns on me that there's a major issue that we didn't touch. We touched on it in our last program last Wednesday, but we didn't touch on it today. And that is Sean Wilentz's book entitled No Property in Man, Slavery and Anti-Slavery at the Nation's Founding. And I'm not going to go back because I know I did much of this last Wednesday, and I don't want to go back and repeat the same thing. But what I would like to stress is the title of Sean Wilentz's book, No Property in Man. Without reading Madison's essay on property, that phrase wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. But reading Madison's essay on property brings that title of Wilentz's book to life. Because Wilentz's book title is based on Madison's broader point of view about slavery. Basically, his book title is consistent with Madison's idea of man's property in its broadest sense, man property in his rights. Wilentz's argument that contrary to popular belief, that the Constitutional Convention made so many compromises with slave owners, with slavery, with the slave states in writing the Constitution, that many people have believed and continue to believe that the Constitution's condoning of slavery flaws the Constitution, makes it less worthy of respect than the Constitution should receive. That begins, of course, with the abolitionists in the early 19th century, because the Constitution seemed to condone slavery and included a number of pro-slave concessions to the institution of slavery. Not just the 3/5 compromise, not just the allowing of the slave trade to continue for another 20 years, when most of the other developed nations of the world had already or were in the process of abolishing slavery. But other things related to taxes and such. Most historians, many people have concluded that the founders made a pact with the devil when they condoned slavery in the Constitution. Wilentz takes issue with that because he says that if the founders intended to support and condone slavery, to justify it, they would have said so in the Constitution. But on the contrary, there's nothing in the Constitution which indicates that the founders supported man's right to own other men. No property in man. Madison's essay on property gives us a sense of meaning to that statement. Because that would have indeed condoned slavery. If you looked at the broader sense of property that Madison explains or defines, property in opinions, property in beliefs, property in freedom to apply one's labor, property in conscience, free choice of religion and the right to practice it, etc., etc., etc. What Madison called man's property in rights, that if they wanted to condone or justify or legalize slavery, they would have included it in the Constitution. By not doing it, even though looking at the idea of property in its broadest sense, Wilentz is able to argue that the founders not only didn't condone slavery in the Constitution, but they left a path open eventually to those who set about abolishing it. In other words, they anticipated Lincoln. They anticipated the abolitionists. They anticipated the Emancipation Proclamation. And they didn't include anything in the Constitution that made those things impossible to happen. So Wilentz's argument, Wilentz in a sense, turns the popular view of the history of slavery upside down. And his basic rationale is that the founders made whatever compromises with the South and with slavery they had to make in order to get the Constitution ratified and keep the states together in the Union. That was the number one priority, and whatever they needed to do to make that happen, they did. But his point also is they never went to the extreme and actually included in the Constitution anything that suggested that slavery was a right. Man's right to own other man was legitimized. They don't do that. And Wilentz believed, consequently, that that's significant. And for his evidence, I think this is important. He cites in Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention the statement Madison made in his notes indicating that he delivered a speech at the Philadelphia Convention saying the following: that it would be wrong to admit in the Constitution the idea that there could be property in men. This quotation Wilentz cites 6 different times in his book. Mary Sarah Bilder, in her Bancroft-winning book, Madison's Hand, Revising the Constitutional Convention, believes that Madison added that statement during editing well after the Constitutional Convention was over. That Madison was going over his notes before they became public. And if you recall, his notes were not to be made public until 50 years after his death. That gave him plenty of time to edit. And Bilder believes that he edited this statement about men in not have the Constitution not saying anything about men in property in men after the fact, she believes. I think it's very significant. I think it adds a little bit of credibility to Wilentz. The title, No Property in Man, because that is very consistent with Madison's definition of property, the broader definition, the larger and juster definition, if you will. And I think last week, when we touched on this last Wednesday, I got into a little bit of reasons why it appears that Wilentz is taking this position. And I believe I mentioned the seminar at Princeton on Wilentz's book. It was a panel discussion. And on that panel, and I got it. I misplaced my notes here for a minute. In that panel, which took place on September 28th, this past September 28th, the title of the panel discussion was No Property in Man, Slavery and Anti-Slavery at the Nation's Founding. In other words, it was a panel on Wilentz's book. And joining Wilentz on the panel were Alan C. Guelso, history professor at Gettysburg College, and Rutgers University law professor Earl Maltz. The conversation was sponsored by and hosted by the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions. And the point I was making last Wednesday was that this is an extremely conservative group of scholars, and that this organization and those who attended this particular session as members of the James Madison the James Madison Center are inclined to buy into Wilentz's thesis. As a counter to the claims of progressives, more specifically Bernie Sanders, when he stated on the campaign trail in the 2016 campaign that this nation was founded on racism. And these conservatives in the Madison group are not inclined to accept criticism of the founding. So Wilentz is speaking to a group of friends, if you will, at this particular conference. Wilentz said that with all the concessions that the framers made to the slaveholders, the majority of the Constitutional Convention deliberately refused to acknowledge slavery's legitimacy by refusing to acknowledge the cornerstone of slavery's legality, the right of property in man. And this, it seems to me, is worded in a way which is very consistent with Madison's broader view of the definition of property. And so the exclusion of slavery within this broader view of man's property in rights, by denying one of those rights to be the rights to own other people, that's the basis of Wilentz's entire thesis. The refusal to state that in the Constitution, that slaves could legally be considered property. If they had done so, Wilentz said, they would have rendered the federal government, the new government they were creating, powerless to limit the expansion of slavery into new areas under that government's jurisdiction. In other words, if the Constitution had legitimized slavery, then the government could not have stopped the expansion of slavery into the territories, which was the precipitating factor that got Abraham Lincoln elected. That position of Lincoln's would have been unconstitutional if the Constitution had legitimized property in man. It did not. Let me just bring this to a close by saying this, and this is kind of personal off the top on my part. But I've been thinking a lot about this because it's so very important. We hear all the time now, Kamala Harris is talking about this. By the way, Kamala Harris is having a town meeting tonight at 10 on MSNBC with Lawrence O'Donnell, I believe, as the host. Kamala Harris is one of the people that is arguing that the nation must seriously consider the issue of compensation to African Americans for the damages which the heritage of the institution of slavery has done to them in terms of quality of life and income and job access and all the rest of it. That in effect, the nation, because of the compromises it did make with slavery, owes the people who have become penalized by it, owes them compensation of one kind or another. So this is a timely issue. None of that would have been possible, Wilentz points out, if the Constitution had legitimized slavery as a legitimate right. It did not. And so consequently, everything that Lincoln stood for and ran for the White House on would have been unconstitutional if the Constitution had been worded differently and if it had included a phrase, something like permitting man to own other men. I think it's very significant that this issue continues to be timely and significant and relevant today in our politics. I think the fact that a group like the James Madison program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University takes a position on this particular issue is very consistent, because they would have to do it in order to be consistent with their other conservative beliefs. And I think this says something about Wilentz as well. I think it gives us some insight into where Wilentz is coming from. And I think it gives some legitimacy to the thinking of the author of the book review in the New York Review of Books, Nicholas Guyot, that what was driving Wilentz with this book as much as anything is politics and the political disagreement he got into over this issue with Bernie Sanders in 2015, a dispute which prompted Wilentz to write a New York Times op-ed where he dismissed what he calls the myth that the United States was founded on racial slavery, and he accused Bernie Sanders of poisoning the current presidential campaign, accused Barack Obama of doing the same thing. I think the fact that this issue is being debated this long after the Civil War and the so-called Civil War amendments ending slavery once and for all in this country, I think that we're still debating it is significant. It's significant in several different ways. It seems to speak to how significant the racial issue remains in this country. It speaks to the inability of this country to really deal with this issue directly as we probably should have and could have. It indicates how significant racism remains in this country. And I think what we're seeing in our politics and our election campaigns is the degree to which race in this country remains a very sensitive, very volatile issue. I think right now much of the attention is focusing on the abortion issue for obvious reasons because of the makeup of the Supreme Court. But I really believe that the taking on and solving the issue of race in this country remains something that we are going to have to do at some time. And I think the fact that we are debating it now, even over this particular book, I think is a good sign. Because you need to talk about it, you need to face it if you're going to really resolve it. With that, I do believe that Madison's essay on property, that's about as much as I can do or would elect to do with that particular document. But if you've yet to read it, I would suggest that if you go online, just Google James Madison on property, essay on property, and you'll get it. The date is March 1792. There's a piece that I came across in my reading that relates to today's events, political events, that I found particularly eye-opening. And it refers specifically to the meeting in the White House last week that Donald Trump had with Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, and other leading Democrats about the issue of infrastructure. This meeting, I think, was scheduled for Wednesday last week. Apparently, Democrats went into that meeting totally optimistic because a few weeks before, they had gotten from President Trump agreement that despite the issues that divide the two parties, infrastructure was something that they all agreed on as being necessary, as being fundamental. And they agreed to get back together again and work on that issue in the face of all the other issues and the investigations and everything else. And then, as we know, the meeting never happened. And we get different versions of what exactly did happen. The president says that he had no choice but to throw down the gauntlet and say, until the investigations of my administration, my campaign, My personal finances stop. We're not going to work together on anything, including infrastructure. The president, on the other hand, says that he didn't stomp out of the meeting. He didn't blow up the meeting, despite what Democrats say. But that he had made a reasonable calculation that we can't work together as long as all of this other stuff is going on against me. The implication, of course, was that this decision was made on site, that it was made at the time. It was not planned. We know that that is kind of in question, because when the president left the meeting, he walked into the Rose Garden, supposedly for an impromptu news conference, but there was already a podium set up with dollar figures and signs saying no collusion, no obstruction. The whole thing seemed to suggest a planned spectacle. In the midst of that, dated the 26th of May, which would be Sunday, there's this article that I ran across in the New York Times about the extent to which that the falling apart of conversations on infrastructure is disturbing business leaders and community leaders around the country, because they see the need for what this article calls a deteriorating and outdated infrastructure. The American Society of Civil Engineers gives this country a D+ in its most recent report on the issue of roads, tunnels, bridges, canals, ports, airports, etc. Trump on Wednesday walked out of the meeting on infrastructure and said there would be no investment until congressional investigations into his personal finances and his administration cease. And many people are upset by that. The executive director of the American Society of Civil Engineers, Tom Smith, made the statement, "Our infrastructure problem is not going to go away. It's certainly not going to get better with time." This article goes back a month and refers to what it calls a cheerful group of Democrats, including Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, who came out of the White House a month ago to announce that they had agreed with President Trump to push for a $2 trillion package on infrastructure. That figure, $2 trillion, twice what Donald Trump had proposed a year earlier, caused Republicans to back off. Democrats at that time asked the White House, before they got together again at their next meeting, to come to the next meeting with ideas on how to fund such a massive spending project. Republicans' political leaders began to suspect that this whole thing about infrastructure was a setup, an effort to set up the president for a political beating. And the reason I find this significant is because instrumental in this political aspect of the infrastructure debate is Grover Norquist, president of Americans for Tax Reform. He made the statement a few weeks ago that the Democrats meeting with the president and their decision to put the onus on President Trump to come up with a financing mechanism betrayed their political motives. Norquist says any Trump proposed tax increase to fund a $2 trillion infrastructure deal would amount to what Norquist called fingerprints on the murder weapon that Democrats could use against Republicans in 2020 elections. In other words, Norquist smelled a plot among the Democrat leaders to ensnare Donald Trump into proposing a budget package to fund infrastructure, which would then open him up to charges of raising taxes. This is a quote from Norquist. They think they could trick the president into agreeing to a stimulus package that they would call infrastructure. And then the president would, in their view, be stupid enough to stand by them while he signed their bill. The president would have simultaneously turned himself into George Herbert Walker Bush. He would have raised taxes on the middle class. He would have raised taxes on the American people. And he would have been crushed in the next election. Unquote. According to the authors of this piece, Trump bought into what Norquist and some of the other Republicans were saying. In an interview on Fox News, President Trump accused the Democrats of turning the infrastructure negotiations into a little bit of a game. This is important. I think it tells us several things. Some of them important, some of the things maybe not so important. One of the manipulated by his advisors at the last minute to change his mind. Again, we seem to have evidence that the last person to speak to the president is the one that influences him. In this case, Grover Norquist. He had agreed on what he ran for office to do, which is to promote infrastructure, create jobs, etc. It's the one thing that that Republicans and Democrats seem to agree on. The problem is the $2 trillion cost over 10 years. How are you going to fund that? But most specifically, how are you going to fund it in today's hostile political environment where everybody, each side, is looking for a way to trap the other side, where nobody can trust anybody? It appeared that in the interest of infrastructure, on the issue of infrastructure, parties that seemed to disagree on everything had found something that they agreed on, that they could work together on. And then suddenly, at the 11th hour, it blew up. It didn't blow up because President Trump saw problems, political problems. It blew up because other people saw political problems and convinced him to do a 180. And he did it. He went to Fox News, accused the Democrats of what he calls a little bit of a game, and basically justified his throwing down the gauntlet to Democrats by saying, as long as the investigations go on, we're not going to work together on anything. This is what President Trump said on Fox News. What they want me to do is say, well, what we'll do is raise taxes, and we'll do this and this and this. And then they'll have a news conference, and they'll say, see, Trump wants to raise taxes. Trump said this in an interview, which was on Fox News on May 19th. Douglas Brinkley, the historian, Douglas Brinkley says that this standoff with Democrats and President Trump is an indication, yet another piece of evidence, that the president really doesn't know how to navigate the political waters in Washington. He can't deliver, even on things that were major political promises he made during the campaign. Brinkley says, quote, it's easy to say you're going to work to fix bridges and highways and dams, but that's just talk. In order to move the ball forward, you have to get out there and cheerlead for public works projects. This president doesn't know how to bring people together, unquote. Basically, then, what we have is dysfunctional government. I really believe, as much as infrastructure needs to be done, our airports are being downgraded in the face of airports throughout the world. There's a picture on my computer, the homepage on my computer, that Google puts up, which is a railroad station, a train station in Moscow that you wouldn't believe. It's marble. It is absolutely gorgeous with art on the walls, and it's just spectacular. It looks like anything but a train station. But to me, it just speaks to how low we've sunk in terms of the way we move people around in this country, or many of the other things that fall under the heading of infrastructure. I really do see a real problem here. However, I have a problem with, I've had a problem for a long time with Grover Norquist. When I was candidate for the legislature in 2016, I received a pledge that his Americans for Tax Reform wanted me, as a candidate for public office, to agree to, which was never, ever, under any circumstances, to support a tax increase. This is an ideological issue which binds many Republicans together. And when they saw the potential for this in the meetings between the Democrats and President Trump over infrastructure, they stopped it. The implication of this is that once you begin to consider the political ramifications of a proposal, no proposal has a chance of passing on anything, it appears. We just got through a few moments ago talking about the issue of race in this country and the need to face up to it and the need to talk about it, and the fact that the debate was happening, at least, and that was an important first step. The fact of the matter is, nothing as complicated and as serious and potentially explosive as race is going to get resolved in today's political world, especially when you have an issue like infrastructure, which is agreed on by so many, but the many who agree on it can't figure out a way to address it. Also, there's one issue that's not mentioned in this whole controversy about funding infrastructure, and that's the president's tax cut bill of December 2017 that blew a hole in the nation's deficit. Predicted to be a $1.5 trillion increase in the nation's debt over 10 years. It made funding a project of $2 trillion on infrastructure or anything else unlikely. And we've seen evidence that Republicans are now looking at Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security as a way to make up the difference in income lost as a result of the tax cut for corporate America in this legislation. And we've seen periodically evidences of major corporations who paid nothing, who got tax refunds in 2018, et cetera, et cetera. We won't go into all of that, but the point is that it seems to me that tax bill is an issue behind this particular issue of infrastructure as well. The ability to fund anything substantial has been dealt a severe blow, it seems to me, by that tax cut bill, which blew a huge hole in the nation's deficit. So I think that figures in to this particular issue as well. But I find it important, although disturbing, about the political aspect of this. This is the philosophy of Grover Norquist, that nobody should support tax increases, that what you do is move money around so that you fund the most important things first, but you can't raise revenue no matter how serious the situation, even in crisis situations. Norquist, in the literature supporting the pledge that he wants political candidates to take, in the rationale he gives for the pledge, he makes the statement that liberals have become proficient at manufacturing false emergencies in order to justify tax increases in the past. So therefore, his argument is that saying under no circumstances, no conditions whatsoever, will I support an increase in taxes, he believes that's justified because there's no way to know whether a particular emergency you're going to be told about is real or made up. Fake emergency, fake news. So I think this is a particularly important article because it kind of tells us where the political pendulum is and how sensitive the president and Republicans are to this issue of taxes and spending. I go back to the idea we looked at in a piece earlier about corporate America and the loss of jobs in China, and the recommendation of the authors that corporations who do this be required to compensate those Americans who lose their jobs as a result of this particular action of moving an industry overseas, rather than just leaving the community devoid of all of those jobs, totally destroying the viability of a whole community by one of these corporate level decisions. The rationale here that these corporations ought to be made to compensate the communities and individual workers for the damage that this decision is doing to them, I think is very significant, but unlikely in the kind of political environment we find ourselves in today. And again, I think the infrastructure situation is an important point because it indicates how much dysfunction there really is, how severe it is. Because infrastructure is something that they agree on. It's not one side trying to convince the other side. The other side's already been convinced. They all know that we need to do something about infrastructure in a major way. But politics, re-election, has become so important that all you need to do is put a political perspective on anything, and it stops it dead. Because it's going to benefit some people and harm other people. And the mere fact that it does that means that it's too politically risky to even think about trying. How did we ever get to this place in our political lives? One has to wonder, it seems to me. I want to share something. We're almost at we got about 2 minutes left in our time together. I just wanted to close by giving you kind of a heads up on tomorrow's program, because I think tomorrow is something that all of us will be interested in. There's an article, I believe it was in the Washington Post, but it's either the Post or the New York Times, I'm not sure which, on fundamentalism in Christianity. And it's a fairly substantive article. It's dated May 25th, and the title of it is "The Day Christian Fundamentalism Was Born." I was drawn to this article by that title, "The Day That Christian Fundamentalism Was Born." I had no idea that there was a particular point in time that could be identified when this whole phenomenon arose. This article by Matthew Avery Sutton is on that particular topic. I think it would make interesting conversation for tomorrow's program. We're right at the top of the hour. We have about 1 minute left. I want to thank you all so very, very much for your continued support of this program, but more importantly of the Head On Radio Network as in toto. Bob and Agnes, Bob Kincaid and Agnes, have done a fantastic job to put this network together and keep it on the air for as long as they have. And the only reason they've been able to do it is because of the support of the people who are considered part of their team. And this is the same team that has made this program possible. So I want you all to know how very, very appreciative I am of what you do for all of us. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of this beautiful Tuesday afternoon. Please don't forget those people who are hurting and hurting badly in our country today. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of the day, and hopefully we'll be able to get together again tomorrow. Thank you so very, very much.